Hello and welcome to Dialogue. From chip supply to investment, the U.S. is sparing no effort to suppress the growth of China's high-tech sectors. But one prominent economist is questioning the U.S. moves and even concluding the U.S. is losing the tech war. So what's the impact of the U.S. tech restrictions if the U.S. is losing the tech war, and how? And how is China dealing with the U.S. blockade? For that, we are honored to have David Paul Goldman, American economic strategist and deputy editor of Asia Times. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Mr. Goldman, welcome to Dialogue. We know that you just left China and returned to the States. So share with us, what's your impression of China, in particular the high-tech industry?
Well, China is in a great transition, and some of the things I saw are extremely promising. For example, I visited Tianjin, which is one of the top 10 ports in the world and the first fully automated port. It uses 5G communications and artificial intelligence to move automated cranes and autonomous vehicles, and it can unload a large container ship in less than an hour at America's largest port of Long Beach in California. That would take a day. So the efficiencies are enormous. And the most impressive thing is that the port itself was designed to be exported to the rest of the world, to be reproduced in many other countries. And it's one of many examples I saw of so-called fourth industrial revolution automation, the application of artificial intelligence to manufacturing, to transportation, and so forth. I visited one of Huawei's manufacturing facilities, and you can see the enormous gains in productivity that are to be had through artificial intelligence. So I think the technologies that China has developed are extremely impressive. The real issue is how fast these can be embraced by the economy as a whole. I think the technologies are there. The demonstration level has done very well. And now the real test is the rate of adoption of these technologies, particularly by the private sector.
Well, that's probably a challenge for China and the economy. But then, we know that you went to Huawei, you paid a visit to Huawei, the telecommunication company. So tell us more about the company. Are they still on the survival mode, or are they ready for further development?
Well, I think Huawei is well past survival mode. One important indicator is that starting in the fourth quarter of this year, Huawei will again offer 5G smartphones. They were not able to do that because American export controls made it impossible for them to obtain the more advanced chips that are required for 5G phones, and that virtually destroyed their handset business. Briefly in 2021, they were the top handset manufacturer in the world, and that business contracted by more than 3/4. The fact that Huawei is able to source domestically produced high-end semiconductors, 7-nanometer chips, is a very important breakthrough. And it shows that China is working around American technology controls faster than most people expected, certainly faster than I expected. From the standpoint of Huawei's business, though, handsets are really a small part of it. What's interesting is that Huawei is known as a maker of telecommunications equipment, but it's becoming really an artificial intelligence company, a cloud company whose main business is facilitation of technology by different businesses. That's a big change in their business plan. It'll take them a while to implement it, but it's actually, I think, very exciting.
Well, we are talking about the tech war or the tech sector on both countries. You recently wrote a piece, why America is losing the tech war with China. So tell us, what motivated you to produce such a piece?
Well, I think that technology controls historically are a very poor way of going about competition. China is certainly a strategic rival to the United States and a major competitor. And as an American, I want America to be the strongest country in the world. I want us to stay ahead of China. The problem is that our investment in our tech sector is very small compared to what it used to be when we went to the moon or we won the Cold War. It's really atrophied, and China has put a great deal more effort into cutting-edge technology than we have. Now, to try to slow China down by putting on tech controls, it will certainly cost China a lot of effort, and it may slow China down a little, but the effects of controls are much, much less than the American administration had hoped. China has a very large number of skilled people. It graduates more engineers than the rest of the world combined. You may not be able to import certain kinds of chips from Taiwan, but you can hire engineers from Taiwan to help you build them at home. So much more quickly than we expect, China's semiconductor industry and related industries are coming up to speed. It's very hard to know exactly how fast this is happening, but as I mentioned, Huawei's ability to offer 5G smartphones, as well as artificial intelligence processors based on high-end chips manufactured in China, that shows that China is adapting much faster than most observers, including me, thought would be the case. So it's really not a good policy. And the other objection, which of course has been made by the American semiconductor industry, is that China is an enormous market. By cutting off American exports to China, we deprive American companies of revenues. And the loss of revenues to American companies as a result of the China sanctions may do more harm than all of the subsidies that the government has offered to the semiconductor industry can compensate for. So according to the semiconductor industry, America may be hurt even more than China by these sanctions. And I think that's an important argument to consider.
But still, Mr. Goldman, many people would argue, the U.S. had this advantage of the high-tech technology, for example, in advanced chips and AI and, quantum computing. China is playing catch-up at this particular point of time. If the U.S., for example, imposes export control or restrictions of the transfer of technology, that definitely will slow down or even put the Chinese development at pause or stop even.
Oh, it really isn't doing any such thing. For one thing, the kind of chips that you require to automate a factory or automate a port, to do the things that really increase productivity, you don't necessarily need the highest end chips. I'll give you an example. When Huawei was banned from buying high-end chips, many people in the United States said, well, that's the end of China's 5G rollout. But it wasn't the case. China installed 2.3 million base stations out of 3 million globally. China led the world in 5G installations. Huawei found out how to make the base stations work perfectly well with older chips, 28 nanometer chips. So the ban on the high-end chips really had a minor effect on China's rollout of 5G infrastructure. And I think the same is true of the industrial and transportation technologies, which will have the biggest economic productivity impact. You might need a lot of computing power for large language models that write poetry or compose a school essay. But to automate a factory, you don't need all of that computing power. So in terms of what I think is most important for China, which is the productivity applications that come from AI, you seem to be doing very well with the quality of chips that you can produce at home. So I don't think it's really effective.
Mm-hmm. According to your study, your research, you wouldn't agree with the U.S., policy of restrictions against the Chinese side. You're basically suggesting that the U.S. should invest more in manufacturing. Is that
exactly. To give you an example, when I was a little boy, John F. Kennedy was president, and he said we're going to the moon. And at that point, we put 2% of GDP into the federal development budget. Now it's 0.3% of GDP. So relative to the size of our economy, it's a tiny fraction of what we used to spend on high-tech development. Under the Reagan administration, when the United States created the digital age and won the Cold War, we were spending about 1.5%. So relative to what we did when America was doing great things, we're spending a tiny fraction of the resources we used to spend. My view is we need to spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year on high-tech development and help push that out through our industries and to help industry to be able to invest in those high-tech areas. We need to run faster to stay ahead of China. To try to make China run slower is a very ineffective policy. So I'm for effective competition with China. My objection to the restrictions is that they are a losing policy, not a winning policy.
Mm-hmm. What about the recent moves, by the Biden administration to ban or limit the investment in the three sectors, for example, AI, quantum computing, and advanced chips, by the U.S. Companies?
Well, I doubt that's going to have a great deal of impact. 10 years ago, perhaps, because China didn't have the expertise. And when American venture capitalists came to China, they brought expertise with them. Take a firm like RSA, which produced radio chips. It was created by an American VC firm, venture capital firm, and eventually bought by Tsinghua Investments. That required a lot of American expertise, but at this point, China has sufficient expertise to be able to make its own investments. So I don't believe that the restrictions are going to have a very big impact. They'll have some impact, but nothing like 10 years ago.
So it's not only about in terms of the financial flow, where is the financial resources, to invest, whether it's from the U.S. or from other countries. If it's not from the U.S., it's really about whether China does, have this financial strength to invest in its own firms, or money from Saudi Arabia or the Middle Eastern countries flowing to China.
Well, money really isn't the issue because China has a very large trade surplus, something like $800 billion a year. That means China receives for its exports $800 billion more than it pays for its imports. So it has to invest that money somewhere. It can put it into Belt and Road projects and buy U.S. treasuries, or it can invest it in high-tech enterprises at home. It can do whatever it wants. China has no shortage of money. The issue much more is expertise and industrial organization. And we've seen very impressive improvements in China's expertise. For example, Huawei is now designing its own chips. 3 years ago, it designed the Kirin chipset and the Kompeng chipset, which are state-of-the-art. Those are things which we used to think only the United States can do. You have automated chip design tools, which used to be an American monopoly. Now it appears that there are Chinese companies which are building their own chip design tools. So certainly, we in the United States, who created the semiconductor industry, we invented all these things. We have a 50-year start on China, and we have a lot of very good technology. But China's rate of catch-up is extremely impressive. And again, in a global world, China may not be able to buy some technology, but it can hire anyone it wants. So talent is very fungible, is very global. So I don't think we can contain this very long. The real problem, in my view, is the lack of American investment in our own basic research and high-tech development. As I said, what we are spending relative to the size of our economy is very small compared to what we did during the Cold War and at the height of the space program under John F. Kennedy. And my recommendation is to go back to that kind of aggressive, forward-looking approach to developing American technology, which I think has always worked, and not try to hold China back, which doesn't appear to be working at all.
We are seeing the competition, in the high-tech sector. On the other hand, we are seeing like officials from both sides are trying to increase the visit, talking to each other. You have Secretary of State Antony Blinken, you have Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and then we are going to have a Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo later this month. How do you see any expectation of the new visit by Raimondo? Like, will it change?
My expectations are very low. This is an election year. It's easy for American politicians to blame China for American problems, and that's a popular thing to do. So I don't believe that the Biden administration is going to make any public or obvious steps that will reduce tensions with China on technology issues, because if they do, the Republicans will attack them. My impression, speaking to many officials in the administration, is that there is a broad recognition that the tech sanctions have not worked out as they hoped. And there also is a very powerful lobby on the part of the American tech industry, the American semiconductor industry and others, who think, as I was saying before, they think that the sanctions will hurt them as much as China, perhaps even more. So I think you will see some quiet efforts to reduce the effect of sanctions at the request of certain industries, but no publicity about it. So at the diplomatic level, in this election year, I'd have very low expectations for any kind of easing of tensions.
Mm-hmm. So just as you said, a few weeks ago, CEOs of top U.S. Semiconductor companies such as NVIDIA and Intel suggested that the Biden administration lift restrictions on the export of high-end chips to China. I think their argument is very similar to what you have said, because they tend to be hurt more probably from these restrictions. So probably there will be pressure, and some change might be happening or might to happen silently.
Yes. You're not going to see it, though. The way the restrictions work is that there isn't an absolute ban. If you're a U.S. tech company and you want to sell something to China and it's on the entity list, you have to get a special license. You apply to the Commerce Department, you try to get an exception. The Commerce Department does not make public which licenses it gives. Mm-hmm. So, as I said, I think there will probably be some leeway granted to American tech companies for exports to China. But I don't think any of this will be publicized.
Mm-hmm. Well, this seems to be part of the job for the Commerce Department. So what's the purpose of, Gina Raimondo's China visit?
I think there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of confusion in the administration, because in October, when the big increase in sanctions was announced, the administration really thought that this would be a crushing blow to China's high-tech industry. And since October, we've learned that it's been much less effective than people hoped. And I think this is broadly understood at the senior staff level in the administration. But once you do something, it's very embarrassing to say, gee, that didn't work. Let's just drop it and do something else, particularly in an election year. So a lot of people have to go through the motions of promoting a policy, even if they don't believe in it for political reasons.
Mm-hmm. Political reasons. Of course, here is a related question. We have seen the visit, as we mentioned, by Antony Blinken, Janet Yellen, and then the upcoming visit by Gina Raimondo. Of course, there's also former Secretary of State Kissinger. It seems that they have failed to produce probably, if this is the purpose, to stabilize the relationship. Why?
Well, the American political system is much more decentralized than the Chinese system. And I think Chinese observers often fail to appreciate how chaotic our system is. And that's by design. We have the Congress, which is elected independently of the president. We have the federal bureaucracy, which has a life of its own. We have an administration, which has many different views. It's really a coalition of different views. So if we act confused and look confused, it's often because we are confused. And the American system was designed to allow many different opinions to have an important influence, which has the advantage of moderating the behavior of the government and the disadvantage of sometimes making our policy completely incoherent. But that's what the American system does. So don't expect consistency from us, especially in an election year.
Yeah, election year, you mentioned, of course, there's it's toxic, probably, the China topic inside domestically. So politicians tend to be probably, or they have to be in some cases, to be tough or to pretend to be tough.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. I got into an argument on Twitter with a friend of mine who worked for the Trump administration at a senior level, and he said, our food supply is in danger. China has bought $2 billion worth of American farmland. And I replied, that is 1/10 of 1% of the farmland in the United States. Learn arithmetic. This is silly. So when you decide that everything China does is bad, and if China does something, it's bad because China is doing it, you end up with real absurdities. Now, personally, as an American, I want the United States to be the strongest country. And I'm alarmed that China is way ahead of us in AI applications to the Internet of Things, manufacturing, transportation, and so forth. I want to reverse this. But because China is a rival, and we need to regard China as a rival, doesn't mean that everything China does is automatically wicked, or that we should oppose everything China does simply because China is doing it. That's simply silly.
Well, we are still talking to each other, and that's important, to see the relationship among the officials. They're trying to talk to each other and have more flights between the two countries. But still, we are seeing, many people are talking about what's next. If you follow the line of the U.S. policies, probably more restrictions or more bans on the high-tech sector in terms of any engagement?
It's very hard to say. What worries me is the possibility that this may end up in violence. Certainly, there's a great deal of tension in the Taiwan Strait, and there are tensions in other parts of Asia. My view is that both sides have made mistakes which might contribute to the increase of tensions. I don't condone everything the Chinese government has done, and I think the United States has made a big mistake. And I think the most important thing is to keep the competition clean and restrict it to areas which don't threaten to get us into a war.
Keep the competition clean. Are you meaning that probably like a decoupling or de-risking, whatever terms here, probably it should be happening in the sector of like economy or tech sector rather than other sectors?
Well, I think that we should be using our creativity and our enormous resources to maintain a technological edge over everyone in the world, to be the dominant provider of technology to the world. We've done that before. I believe we could do it again. But we've really gotten lazy in the last 30 years after we won the Cold War. I'll give you one example. In China, roughly a third of college students study engineering. In America, it's 1 out of 16. And that's why we import so many engineers from China, India, and other countries. And now, with all of the anti-Chinese feeling in Washington, fewer Chinese are coming to the United States to study, and many Chinese are leaving the United States to go back to China because they feel a hostile environment. This, in my view, is very destructive. One of our great advantages in the United States is we are good at assimilating immigrants. China doesn't assimilate immigrants. Very few people immigrate to China, but millions every year immigrate to America. In my view, there's nothing wrong with the United States that 20 million Chinese immigrants wouldn't fix.
But with this 2024 presidential election upcoming, you think the environment probably will become even worse?
I think the environment will get worse before it gets better. Then after 2020, after whatever administration comes in is going to have to face reality. If I'm correct, and China continues to work around the technological restrictions, at some point, the United States will recognize that this policy has failed. The great British leader Winston Churchill famously said, "The United States always does the right thing after trying everything else."
Everything else.
So ultimately, I'm confident we will do the right thing, but I don't think it'll be this year.
Mm-hmm. Well, briefly, Mr. Goldman, what's your vision of these two countries, for example, in terms of their engagement and relationship in the high-tech sector? Is that possible? One country probably excels at a particular technology, the other side at another technology, so there is a peaceful coexistence and also fair competition.
As an economist, that is the ideal. The international division of labor is good for everybody. But there's also a strategic issue. Does the United States look at China as a strategic military rival, and what are the military implications of this? And that's something which the two countries haven't worked out. We say that we are restricting technology exports to China because we're afraid that these will be used for the Chinese military. Now, I personally think that argument is wrong. It's a technical argument, and there's a long explanation. But there is a broader issue, namely, the United States has had a system of alliances in Asia, with not just with Japan and Korea and others, and China is looked at as disruptive and a threat to the region. So I think a great deal of wisdom is required on both sides to de-escalate and create a strategic situation where neither side feels threatened by the other. And that's certainly not the case now. I think I've written elsewhere that the great task of our generation is to avoid a war between China and the United States. And I think both sides have made errors, and both sides have a profound responsibility to their own countries and humanity to avoid a confrontation. Well, in principle, there's no reason for China and the U.S. to fight.
Yeah, wisdom is needed. Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Thank you for your insights and time. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guest, Mr. Goldman. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.